Have the luxury of an esteemed list of panelists, and they are Professor Nerses Kopalyan, Professor Anna Ohanyan, and Sossi Tatikyan, and they're going to discuss the situation in Artsakh and the various possibilities. Just before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about the ARPA Institute for those of you who are not familiar with ARPA. ARPA has been established in 1992, and our main activities are in Armenia. ARPA tries to establish modern facilities and programs in science, engineering, technology, healthcare, and many other areas. Our members are experts in various areas, and we try to provide advice, guidance, as well as very important and necessary devices, equipment, facilities, and also do analysis, research, and planning for future developments in Armenia. We have currently several programs we're working on, the most important being our annual invention competition, which we have every year for young scientists in Armenia. And also, we try to work with the government of Armenia on developing science projects for students in Armenia, which means, as they do in the United States, to do science fairs in every school of Armenia. This is the third year that Armenia has officially accepted this program, and they are now participating in the International Science and Engineering Fair that is held annually in the US. And they actually won 2 awards so far. So we're encouraging that, and also we're training teachers on how to organize science fairs in Armenia. And also we have a special program with STEMAR, which is another company that is helping us train teachers as well as initiate various STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math programs in various schools in the Davush area. We also have now several programs with the institutes of the Academy of Sciences and the Yerevan State and the universities in Armenia. The most important one is we have a clean room in the Ohanyan National Lab, a class 1000 clean room, which is the first of its kind in Armenia. And we are working on that and helping provide all the necessary equipment as well as train specialists in order to be able to operate the clean room properly. And also we have a program now with the Yerevan State University where 5 scientists are working with Professor Artsakh of University of California, Irvine on a new project where they study confined light. They analyze confined light and develop the theory for it. At the same time, related to the same program, Artsakh is also heading a research project in the Ohanyan National Lab, where we are studying silicon chips with a new approach that will actually raise the efficiency of solar electricity up to 45%, which makes it very competitive to petroleum. And then, of course, once that is established, Armenia could have quite a large economic benefit if we are successful, and we are hoping that we will. At the same time, now we are organizing a new program in the Polytechnic University, where we will establish a center of excellence for circuit design, where we will provide specialized servers and computers and train teachers so that they can teach the Cadence software, where they will learn on an international level how to design circuits, very complex circuits, which will make it very attractive for large companies to come to Armenia. So these are the kinds of activities that we have, and the only activity we have outside of Armenia is this panel discussion or presentations. They're all related to Armenia or Armenians in general. And right now, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ani Shabazian, who has her PhD in history and psychology from UCLA, and also a PhD from on human development from Harvard University. And she's currently the director of Loyola Marymount Children's Center, and at the same time, a tenured professor there. She has been the director of the UCLA Infant Development Program, and also she has worked internationally on quite a few different children's related programs. And also she's
70 years ago this
week,
the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh.
I'm sorry. Ani, the floor is yours. Ani? I'm sorry, I guess Ani, we've lost Ani for some reason. Maybe it's the
Jacob, we can hear you, Jacob.
Oh, how about now?
Now it's okay.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what's going on these days. So as I said, we have a storm and things are happening, and I don't know if we will get Ani back, but I think what we are going to do right now is introduce our speakers. I will introduce the first speaker, Sossi Tatikyan. Sossi has a diploma from Yerevan State University and an MPA from an ESCP Business School of Harvard University. She's a PhD researcher in Brussels School of International Studies, and has been a NATO Defense College Fellow. She has been a diplomat representing Armenia in NATO, UNODC, IAEA, and OPCW. She has worked in the OSCE and the UN on political and peacekeeping missions in Kosovo, Timor-Leste, and Central African Republic as a political and security reform advisor and a program analyst, and cooperated with the EU, European Union, and African Union. She has coordinated UNDP and US Freedom House and consulted DCAF projects in Armenia. She has advised on public, foreign, and security policy. She has policy articles on and papers, and has given a series of TV interviews. She's a member of the UN Senior Woman Talent Pipeline, and she's teaching leadership in the American University of Armenia. Sossi, please introduce to us the situation, the current situation, going back maybe a little bit, and giving a description of what has happened in the past and what is the current situation. Please.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So I will focus on Artsakh today. That's our main topic, because if we also describe the situation in Armenia, it will be very, very long. So I'll try to be very brief. As we know, after the war, there was a ceasefire statement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. And instead of international peacekeepers, Russian peacekeepers were deployed without an international mandate. In the first few months, the situation was relatively fine. Then in February 21, Russian peacekeepers started banning the international human rights NGOs and journalists to enter Artsakh. In March, there was the first major escalation when Azerbaijani troops started advancing and taking new positions, and they took Parukh village and mountain. Sorry, I forgot, because actually it's not true. Still in December 2020, just 3 weeks after the ceasefire, Azerbaijanis already violated the ceasefire agreement, and they captured the last 2 villages in Hadrut and a very strategic mountain with an old monastery. So after the escalation in March, it was already during the war in Ukraine. There was a relative calm until August, and then in August, the escalation started continuing, and actually they also captured the Lachin corridor last year. They made a pressure on the Armenian side, and Artsakh authorities decided to basically to concede Aghavno village and Lachin corridor to them, but there was a condition that there should be a new Lachin corridor in line with the 2020 November statement. So after a couple of weeks, this new road was established, and although it wasn't as wide and as convenient as the old one, but it functioned for a while. And then in December, there were eco-protests, pseudo-eco protests, because apparently those protesters were government-sponsored, and they were protesting against illegal mine exploitation in Artsakh. Apparently, this mine was sold to an Anglo-American company by Azerbaijan, which was actually not really an Anglo-American, because all major investors and owners there are either Iranian Azerbaijani or anyway, so there are, it's not really an Anglo-American, it's more like an Azerbaijani company undercover. And then in February, International Court of Justice decided and issued a provisional order that the corridor should be deblocked, and the freedom of movement should be restored, those of persons, commercial vehicles, and also cargo. However, Azerbaijani side didn't implement the order, and it was deepening the blockade more and more, because in the beginning it was not total, it was only partial, because humanitarian cargo could enter Artsakh by Russian peacekeepers and ICRC, the Red Cross International Committee. However, in April, they established a checkpoint, and overnight, pseudo-eco protesters were replaced with Azerbaijani border services. They said that it's our territory, so we have a right to establish a checkpoint. And then in May, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Pashinyan, recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. This part wasn't new because it was recognized still in October 2020. However, this time it included Artsakh. In mid-June, Azerbaijani border services started blocking Russian peacekeepers. They didn't allow them to bring in food and other humanitarian cargo anymore. And after a couple of weeks, they made an allegation to ICRC, Red Cross, that they are smuggling cigarettes, fuel, and some mobile phone screens to Artsakh, and they banned even ICRC Sometimes they allow ICRC to enter for only medical evacuation, but they don't allow them to bring in any food and not even any medicine. So it has been now almost 2 months, even more, without any food and even medicine entering Artsakh. The situation became extremely serious in mid-July when Artsakh started running out of food, fuel, and medicine, and even baby food. So now the situation is catastrophic. People are malnutrition. Pregnant women, some of them have lost their unborn children, or some of them couldn't make it to the hospital. There was a first direct case out of malnutrition and starvation of a 40-year-old man. There are many disabled people or people who live in villages. They cannot get food because they don't need fuel and they don't need vehicles. So the situation is extremely serious. People are literally starving. Armenia was conducting very serious diplomatic efforts, very intensive. It urged a Security Council resolution, a Security Council meeting of the United Nations last week. It happened. It was quite frustrating because most of the statements didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation, although they recognized that there is a humanitarian crisis, but they weren't very vocal. They were urging Azerbaijan to open the road, but some countries were linking it with the Azerbaijani offer to open an alternative road, which is through Aghdam. And Artsakh Armenians are really afraid of opening of this road because they have security concerns, and there is just no trust and confidence between the parties. So now basically the US and EU are urging Stepanakert to talk to Baku. There are differences of opinion here because the US and European Union are ready to facilitate those direct talks in a neutral place, like in some European capital, and to be present. However, Russia and Azerbaijan are trying to organize a similar meeting at a much lower level and in the territory of Azerbaijan, in the vicinity of Artsakh, which is something that can be a trap, and Stepanakert authorities are very cautious about it. So the situation is extremely serious. There was no Security Council resolution after the meeting. It ended only with a discussion, and the only hope now is that there will be some more peace talks and direct talks between Baku and Stepanakert. However, if Stepanakert wants to discuss their rights and security guarantees, Baku is stating that it will never grant any status to Artsakh. We are not talking about independence. We are not talking even about autonomy here. They are not even ready to grant any kind of like cultural autonomy. They are saying that they will grant rights in line with Azerbaijan's constitution, which, as we know, is an autocratic state, as a national minority with minimal rights. So I think I talked too long. Sorry for that, but it's really difficult to talk about those things briefly. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Sossi. And right now, let's go to the other panelists, and I will introduce the second speaker, Anna Ohanyan. Anna is a Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College, and she's a two-time Fulbright Scholar to South Caucasus. She has authored 4 books on Russia and on conflict management and Velvet Revolution of Armenia, and numerous articles in journals and newspapers such as the Washington Post, Foreign Policy magazine, and others. Professor Ohanyan served as a doctoral fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Her research has been supported by IREX, the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars, the German Marshall Fund, the U.S. State Department, and the Eurasia Foundation. She has consulted for numerous organizations such as the United Nations Foundation, the World Bank, the National Intelligence Council Project, the U.S. Department of State, the Carter Center, and USAID. Her fieldwork has taken her to Russia, North Ireland, the South Caucasus, and the Balkans. So please, Anna, why don't you share with us your ideas on what happened to the situation currently, what is going on right now, and how do you see things developing?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Jakob, and thank you all for joining on us on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, depending, or Sunday evening, depending where you are. I'll try to keep my comments short so that we'll have more time for Q&A. I would like to take advantage of the opportunity to have Nerses and Sossi in the same Zoom room to bounce off ideas. So hopefully we'll kind of think out loud as the audience hopefully can join in as well. Few quick comments in regards as to what's the way I see how things are developing right now. Thank you, Sossi, very much for the background information and as well as for the intensive writing you have been doing. We realize these are very important, not very easy. But very briefly, in terms of actually, let me just start with one rather provocative point, is that and again, this is a point that I'm actually thinking out loud myself here. I'm trying to understand the situation as well. But that one provocative point is that Nagorno-Karabakh, and I do use Nagorno-Karabakh rather than Artsakh specifically and on point and deliberately, that Nagorno-Karabakh as an entity, as a national self-determination movement, is due for strategic transformation in the movement. This might seem somewhat obvious, but it also might seem somewhat provocative considering the massive geopolitical obstacles that are there. But I do think that looking at the context after the 2020, as well as after the blockade, that so far the key distinction, the key characteristic, an indicator of how things have been developing, the Nagorno-Karabakh as well as Armenian diplomacy has been very much reliant, obviously, on Russia for all kinds of reasons to which we do not need to go in, maybe we will, as well. And right now, there are two major diplomatic tracks of peace processes unfolding, which again, both of which share the position that they both seem to see Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. What I do argue, and I'll get to that in a little bit, is that looking at similar conflicts around the world, similar national self-determination conflicts around the world, one thing in which Nagorno-Karabakh national self-determination movement has not been doing as much is that very strategic, sustained movement and civic disobedience campaigns directed at Baku as well as internationally. Sossi regularly talks and compares this conflict to Kosovo for all kinds of very good reasons. But over the past year or two, and maybe I should have done this sooner, I've been looking and studying East Timor as an interesting case. So specifically to highlight the importance of civic disobedience movement inside Nagorno-Karabakh. And again, let me now, before trying to support that argument, let me just simply provide a general sort of assessment as to where I see things stand right now. Overall, and again, 2020 has been a pivotal, transformational year. Transformational might not be, obviously is not the right word, but it is an important pivotal year in a way that it changed the structure and the posture of the peace process, the possibilities, as well as the risks. As we have been witnessing, obviously, after 2020, post-war conditions in general are very fragile, but they're also important in telling us as to how the victorious power is behaving. Whether the victorious power will move towards peace process, essentially trying to win the peace, which is as much harder than winning a war, or whether the victorious power will move to consolidate the victory, which is usually done through coercive measures. And obviously, we don't need to be a rocket scientist to see as to where Azerbaijan has been heading. So clearly we see that Azerbaijan is using the peace process for victory consolidation processes and is using hybrid warfare strategies. So which is why I do like to say that someone's peace process is someone else's hybrid warfare. And considering that there are multiple third-party players, the global conflict management infrastructure is fragmented, this is actually quite doable on the side of victorious states. We see this pattern not only in the case of Azerbaijan, as well as in other conflict cases around the world right now. There are about 75 cases of national self-determination movements going on. So hybridity, peace process versus a hybrid war, that does not mean that Armenia should not negotiate or Nagorno-Karabakh. It just simply means that it's important to be aware as to how these hybrid war strategies, how peace processes can be captured. Number two, the situation is also explained by the fact that the November 9 agreement was very, very complex and complicated piece of document, simply because despite its complexity, it lacked any organizational structure for implementation. Right after the war, I have written for Carnegie for arguing that the only way for that agreement to be implemented is for the West and Russia to, this was before Ukraine war, is for the Russia and the West to coordinate, to cooperate, that this was too complex for Russia to do it on its own, even if it wanted to, it couldn't. And it's a big question as to what Russia's aims are in managing in its position relative to this conflict. Another factor is obvious: Ukraine war, geopolitical division, fragmentation of conflict management, which is why it's difficult to even form any consensus to get the UN move in a particular direction. But with that still, a little bit of a side note, a little research that I have done on the factors that will shape United Nations to move in one way or another. United Nations Security Council seems to favor or build preventive capacities in those conflicts that have had a violent past, but are currently in non-violent. I'm sorry, there's a...
Please mute yourself, Chris. Where is it? Yes, okay.
So
sorry.
United Nations does tend to, in terms of for the United States, again, looking at quantitative data, UN Security Council tends to move towards prevention in conflict cases where there has been a violent strategy in the past, but that now the conflict has moved towards nonviolent strategies. The second factor, which seems to matter, is the propensity of the conflict to produce a regional implication. Now, another factor to consider is that the 2020 and the week resulted in a weakening, a near disappearance of Armenia as a guarantor, which obviously created all kinds of risks for Nagorno-Karabakh, but it also signals the need that there is a decoupling of peace processes, the need from international diplomacy for Nagorno-Karabakh, from the need for diplomacy for Armenia's territorial integrity. So I do see that this decoupling, in a way, does necessitate the strategic transformation of diplomatic engagement, necessitating for Nagorno-Karabakh to emerge as and I realize the people in Nagorno-Karabakh are in such difficult conditions, needless to say, but I do think that the voice for Nagorno-Karabakh needs to be audible, a lot more organized, and we can talk about as to why I do think that is the case, because that way Nagorno-Karabakh will have more legitimacy internationally in pressing its case for national self-determination, whether it is within Azerbaijan with status, guaranteed rights, or outside, which right now does not look realistic at all. In terms of key component here, achievable, that I do think Nagorno-Karabakh as an entity does need to look out for or work towards is to find a space at the negotiation table. And again, this might sound unreasonable considering how things are happening, but one thing that has not been tried, has not been carried out, is, again, civic non-violent mass-scale disobedience campaigns. And again, looking at data of comparative conflicts, these types of non-violent strategies have a much better track record of forcing a concession, forcing a dialogue with the state than violent strategies. Violent strategies are not sustainable for Nagorno-Karabakh, and non-violent strategies, mass scale, whether these are large-scale mass movements or small-scale mass movements, internationalizing, targeting Baku is really going to be crucial. In terms of and I'll conclude and hand it over to Nerses. I'll elaborate on this points later on. In terms of as to why these types of strategies that are known, that have been shown to be more effective, obviously the pressure is the emphasis on international factors in influencing the behavior of Baku, in forcing Baku to see Nagorno-Karabakh as at the negotiation table. So several factors matter here, whether a particular target country, in this case Azerbaijan, its military and economic ties. The US military assistance to Azerbaijan is a point that needs to be advanced and targeted. Economic ties are crucial. The fact that it is obviously an oil state, but a very decline, does not have a lot of oil reserves left, and it is due for it is a prime candidate for sanctions regimes to work. Sanctions do not always work, cases such as Russia or Iran, but in cases where resources are limited, they're shown to be much more effective. Aid dependence is a factor. I haven't looked at, Baku has shielded its dependence on aid for a while, so I have to look at this factor in that respect to kind of making itself immune to international pressure, the relevance of reputational costs, the global balance of power. But one factor that is also linked as to whether these types of international pressure factors will matter is the extent of local monitoring. And in this respect, obviously, the infrastructure is very bare. One last point, again, very much looking at the East Timor case that I would like to, again, leave you with when I do think about these conditions for strategic transformation. On the one hand, the presence of Russian forces and political weakness for the Kremlin, it does create some political room to maneuver for Nagorno-Karabakh in organizing and executing these types of mass-scale political protests inside Nagorno-Karabakh. These types of movements need to be framed universally, rather than being framed as narrow national self-determination rights, which are important. But they need to be linked to much more global. National self-determination rights on their own are universal human rights, obviously, but the narrative needs to be broadened, connecting to ongoing movements around the world. In one issue, again, I'm looking at, these types of movements need to be a lot more in tune with what's going on inside Azerbaijan. Protests need to be linked to for example, there was Soyudlu, right? Environmental protests in that Soyudlu village, they were crushed in a very bloody way. Linking in with that, with narrative, voicing, and having banners like that will allow for Nagorno-Karabakh to broaden its coalition and start peeling off forces from Azerbaijan. This is what East Timor did in forming alliances with groups inside Indonesia. Another major factor is that will allow some sort of a linkage is the fact that we see this blockade as singular, right? Closure of borders. Keep in mind that Azerbaijan has kept its land borders closed for ground transportation for Azerbaijanis, which created enormous economic hardship. Again, orchestrating these types of movements and linking it with domestic issues, this increases the costs on Baku in keeping this blockade going. And the ultimate goal, I would argue, is the need to pressure Baku to negotiation table with Nagorno-Karabakh. We'll conclude much stronger voice on pressuring the Western capitals, which again, essentially what many similar conflict cases have done, because whether Russia, and I'll conclude with this, I promise, whether Russia or the West, the emphasis of the international community is to keep conflicts contained inside state borders, promoting, and right now Nagorno-Karabakh does not have a champion for independence and autonomy, but pressuring the Western capitals to provide for security, to keep Baku really to maintain accountability over Baku in transparent peace processes, to keeping Baku at the negotiation table, I think is a doable task. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, we have our moderator back, so I guess, Ani, now you can take over, please.
I'm so sorry. The electricity has been so intermittent here in LA. We have awful rains, but I definitely want to introduce our third panelist and situate us a little bit in the conversation. Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, who is joining us here today, and I have the honor of speaking to him for the second time, is an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international relations, geopolitics, political theory, and philosophy of science. He has conducted extensive research on polarity, superpower relations, and security studies. He has authored books as well as written 2 policy papers for the Republic of Armenia and serves as an advisor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs. His current focus is on geopolitical and great power relations with an emphasis on Eurasia. Thank you for your time here today, Nerses.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this panel. This is a very important subject of conversation to engage in. Sossi provided a very solid contextual background on the developments with respect to the blockade, and Anna, of course, provided a multi-layered and nuanced treatment of the developments. What I want to do is I want to discuss about the contextual context with respect to the various contours that are shaping the developments in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh, and how this is going to basically play out at the international level and potentially at the local level. And I do want to note what Anna said. In internal conversation, I use the term Artsakh, but when speaking to the outside world and the academia, we have to use the word Nagorno-Karabakh because we need to speak in a language that resonates, or else you're going to be ignored and you're going to be speaking to a echo chamber. So there needs to be sort of that, to be cognizant of that, of the usage of the terms, but it has no substantive meaning as far as what it means to us.
I think, Dr. Kopalyan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's such an important point. Can you discuss just very briefly why?
Well, generally speaking, Artsakh has not simply geographical and historical relevance to us. It has collectively certain epistemological meaning to us, that the term means something. It's part of identity construction. And so when we speak of the Artsakh kingdom, historically speaking, or the identity of the Armenians in the territory that the international community calls Nagorno-Karabakh, to us, Artsakhness is a modality of thinking and connecting that cannot be simply reduced to a territorial contraption or construction that we see on a map. So that connection is very important. Now, from the international lens, of course, they understand and view the territory as Nagorno-Karabakh. And so when we utilize the term Artsakh, 1, it doesn't resonate with them, and 2, they view it as a politicized term, and that in of itself creates complications, and it does disrupt the ability to engage in healthy discourse. So it's a question of who the audience is.
May I add something?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just because basically Artsakh was integrated to the Soviet Azerbaijan as Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. And although we didn't like it until very recently, but now we have to like it in a way, because that's the only official name on any map for Artsakh as a territorial entity. And what Azerbaijan is trying to do is it's trying to abolish it as a territorial integrity, not give it any status, and turn Armenians in Artsakh into a national minority, dispersing Azerbaijan without their self-governance bodies and without having their coherent territory. So now, because the situation is so disastrous, the only hope basically that we have is to preserve this territorial entity and to preserve Armenians in territorial entity with some kind of self-governance institutions.
Okay.
That's why this term is very important. And this term, although they are saying it former Nagorno-Karabakh, because Azerbaijan totally refutes and gets extremely angry because of the use of the term Nagorno-Karabakh, but European Union does use former Nagorno-Karabakh just to underline that there is some kind of territorial entity. Sorry for interrupting, but I thought
thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So again, the question isn't how Nagorno-Karabakh is being utilized. There have been different variations in the last year, specifically with the way Azerbaijan's been attempting to pervade the concept. Absolutely. My reference was how Armenians used the dichotomous conceptualization of Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh. And so I was specifying Anna's point. Sossi confirmed that in the international discourse, the concept does have substantive legal meanings, whereas Artsakh has no international legal standing and conceptually it's alien to most. This is why the terms are utilized interchangeably and depending on who the audience is. As far as the conceptual contours that I want to engage in, and clearly, the international community has made it very clear that at this point and within this context, territorial integrity supersedes any discussion of self-determination, whether we're talking about external self-determination or internal self-determination. That is a foregone conclusion, whether we like it or not. So we will be operating under the logic, we by mean both Stepanakert and Yerevan, and the broader Armenian nation, one would say, under the logic that the discussion of self-determination at this point cannot sufficiently or in a very effective way combat the dominance of territorial integrity. Again, regardless of if it's just or unjust, that is the reality of the matter. Now, why did territorial integrity prevail? Well, there are obviously literature shows few extensive cases, but there are few specific ones that we need to touch up on. One, Artsakh's issue of Artsakh's issue of self-determination wasn't taken seriously by the international community. The international community has always viewed Artsakh's discussion of self-determination as being an extension of Armenia's claims on Artsakh and absorbing Artsakh. In that context, when we say self-determination is against territorial integrity, the international community understood it differently. They said, no, Armenia wants to take this territory and make it their own, therefore fully violating Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. So the self-determination conversation has not resonated with the international community. So we do have robust international legal basis to make that argument, but that argument hasn't resonated because the understanding has been there is an ulterior motive of that we've had. So that has obviously constrained us. Now, what Azerbaijan has done in the last 8 months since the blockade, but more acutely in the last 6 months by basically introducing this cost of integration, is that they have utilized a concept that we use in the literature, in the scholarship, known as autocratic legalism. And I've written about this recently with the EVN report. And what Azerbaijan has done is they basically weaponized and instrumentalized their laws and the legal system to reinforce authoritarianism. And they're using the legal argument to say the Armenian population of Azerbaijan, quote unquote, right, has to be reintegrated into Azerbaijani society per the laws of Azerbaijan. So their argument is, this is our territory. Everybody recognizes our territorial integrity, and our laws are equally applicable to anybody that lives within our territory. Based on that logic, we are going to use the concept of legalism to justify the integration of the Armenian population into Azerbaijan. Now, why is this problematic and why isn't anybody taking this seriously? Because this is not legalism as we understand it, but this is a notion of autocratic legalism, where the law isn't used consistently on anyone or rest of society, but rather the law is used, abused to serve specific elite interests. So in that context, the unequal application of the law clearly negates legality, and it's an exercise in what we call constitutional malice. And so borrowing from the broader scholarship, we understand what Azerbaijan is doing. They are abusing the concept of territorial integrity. They are utilizing autocratic legalism to justify their behavior. And this isn't new. There are several comparative studies that affirm this. Hungary, for example, has utilized autocratic legalism, but Orban has done that for its domestic consolidation illiberal behavior. Turkey has used that against both external factors on its border areas and its domestic treatment of the Kurds and a lot of the refugees. And of course, Russia is precisely doing that with respect to Ukraine. For example, prior to Russia's invasion, when Russia unilaterally recognized Luhansk and Donetsk as legal parts of Russia and part of its constitution, this was a case of autocratic legalism, where Russia used its constitutional precepts to justify its behavior. Azerbaijan is doing the same thing. So in that context, Azerbaijan is using its constitution to advance authoritarian means, and they are abusing the concept of territorial integrity to do it. So understanding these dynamics, right, it becomes very obvious why having a conversation on territorial integrity in of itself isn't sufficient. The conversation should revolve around, is territorial integrity being abused and how that is being done? We have never had this conversation. It's always been our self-determination against territorial integrity, and both are equal per international law, or we should have a competing conversation about this, but we have evolved past that conversation. So the contextual contours are basically guiding us that we should deconstruct the way territorial integrity is weaponized and abused by Azerbaijan. Now, why is that important? Because that has shaped the negotiating process. Anna brought up the importance of the two-track process that we've seen proceed. Yerevan, Baku, and Stepanakert, Baku. The territorial integrity discourse basically says that you have two separate countries, right? Armenia and Azerbaijan. They should engage in negotiations. Very good. But then what happens to the people of Artsakh, right? What happens to the population of Nagorno-Karabakh? Within what framework or structure are they to be engaged? And this is very crucial because the United States and the Europeans have come in and they said, okay, Baku needs to talk to the Armenians. And in that context, the second track, there's been an attempt to establish a negotiating process, a platform between Stepanakert and Baku. This has not been successful. I'm not going to get into the reasons why it's not been successful. Maybe there might be questions on it, but I want to refrain from that at the moment. But what we do want to understand are two issues here. One, the Stepanakert-Baku track is very sensitive because Baku is going to weaponize and use every mechanism to disrupt it. Second, we also have to be honest about an important issue that also creates obstacles to the healthy development of this track, and that is the credibility problem that Stepanakert has in Western capitals. Because the leadership in Stepanakert, not the people, but the very narrow leadership in Stepanakert is viewed as being some extension of Russian interests, this is creating severe problems when we try to bring international instruments or international mechanisms to protect the Artsakh negotiators of the population within the negotiating track. So in that context, between this discourse on the negotiating tracks and between the discourse on territorial integrity and what the rights and protection and privileges are of the Armenian population, we need to be very clear on how the concept of territorial integrity is being weaponized and abused. I'll stop there and then we'll continue with more questions.
Anna or Sossi, would you like to add to that commentary?
Yes, because, in fact, I just described the situation, but I haven't really presented some of my views. And Anna and Nerses presented an amazing insight of the situation. I would like to add some of my points and react to some of what they said. I've worked in East Timor for 3 years and in Kosovo for 3 years. And I was used to look at the situation in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh from that point of view. Anna mentioned the parallels between Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh. Here, I have to slightly disagree with Anna, because although I was doing it myself, but then when I did an extensive research, I realized that Timor-Leste or East Timor is viewed from a totally different perspective in the context of self-determination and secession, because it's viewed in the context of decolonization, because it was considered independent after Portugal decolonized it. And then Indonesia annexed it, and in fact the UN had recognized it as an annexed territory for 30 years. In spite of it, even if it was recognized as annexed, international community did literally nothing to de-occupy it for 30 years, until real massacres reaching almost the genocidal level started there. And Australians were even cooperating with Indonesia. So why I'm bringing this example is because actually I agree with Anna in that international community is used to intervene when there is an extreme violence, when there are real massacres, when there are many civilian casualties, when there is a real bloodshed, and not just between militaries, but among civilians, when there are thousands of civilian victims and many thousands of refugees and displaced. So this may be one of the reasons that even now, when the former prosecutor of ICC has produced a report saying that this is a genocide in progress, but still international community might not take it seriously enough. However, my analysis in my 4 large articles in the last month is that Azerbaijan is abusing, Nerses talked about the abuse of the notion of territorial integrity. I totally agree, and I would like to add a few things here. It abuses territorial integrity, and it abuses also the notion of integration. Because if I'm European and I hear that Azerbaijan wants to integrate Armenians, my reaction is positive. I have been explaining to European Union officials during public diplomacy meetings why integration that Azerbaijan means is totally different from the integration that means, let's say, France or Spain, because they mean equal rights to migrants. And what Azerbaijan is trying to do, it tries to distort the history. It has launched historical revisionism as a state strategy and policy. It says that not only Armenians are newcomers in ancient indigenous land of Azerbaijan, meaning Artsakh, but it even claims that Armenia has been Azerbaijani native land and Armenians are newcomers. And they have started calling Armenia Western Azerbaijan. These are really scary developments, and we may laugh, but you know, we were laughing for 30 years. I was a 24 years old young diplomat when I went to Vienna to work in UN specialized agencies, and I was shocked seeing that Azerbaijani diplomats would turn any meeting, whether it was about nuclear issues or drugs or whatever, to an anti-Armenian propaganda and present themselves as a victim and Armenians as an aggressor. And in fact, before we had a military victory, military defeat, we had a diplomatic defeat, because Azerbaijan had so aggressively promoted their narratives that we have been the aggressor and they have been the victims. And we have been the other extreme, that we have had really laid back, lazy diplomacy and army building, just trying to preserve the status quo and not having internal honest discourse, even about having captured surrounding territories to Nagorno-Karabakh, which was extremely problematic from the point of view of international law. But anyway, this is a very long conversation. But why I still tend to compare Nagorno-Karabakh with Kosovo, although some Armenians don't like it because they think Kosovo is a different, they look at Kosovo from a different point of view, is because in fact, the conflict has started very similarly in 1990s or at the end of 80s. So basically, there has been this peaceful movement in both Kosovo and Nagorno-Karabakh to secede, whether to become independent or to unify, in our case, Armenia and Artsakh, and in Kosovo case, Kosovo and Albania. And then Milosevic has abolished the autonomous status in Kosovo and started oppressions and then military offensives. And in Artsakh case, Aliyev father has done the same thing. And here is where the difference starts, because the difference is that international community, namely the US and the West, a collective West, has launched a humanitarian intervention to rescue Kosovo from Milosevic forces. In our case, nobody has come to rescue Artsakh, so Armenia had to intervene, basically, launch a humanitarian intervention to prevent massacres and ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Artsakh. And then, because also of the role of Russia in all of this, because Azerbaijan has managed to convince the international community that we have won in the first war thanks to Russia, which is not true, because Russia has at times collaborated with Azerbaijanis during the First Karabakh War and conducted a joint deportation of Armenians or massacres. But we have lost in this war of narratives for 30 years, and Azerbaijan is continuing extremely aggressive war of narratives. Every day they are coming up with tens of new aggressive, totally manipulative war of narratives. Anna mentioned hybrid war, so it's a lot of disinformation coming from them. And in fact, what it is trying is the following three scenarios. First, make Armenians to evacuate, like Soviet Russia made Finns to evacuate from Karelia in 1940s. The second, basically to starve them to death, although there is a view that at one point Azerbaijan will avoid a political cost and maybe will open the corridor one way so people could leave. But in this case, it's not even clear whether it will allow everybody or only women and children, because now it claims that all men have taken part in a war, so they are all war criminals. And the third one, that it may launch a military intervention resembling a gay military and intervention in Balkans, like in the same Kosovo and Sarajevo, Siege and Srebrenica, and again target especially men. So these are all very scary scenarios. And to be honest, now we are talking about survival of Armenians there, whether they will be able to stay there and whether they will be able to have a dignified life. And here I have to disagree with Nerses, who has disappeared from my camera, because Nerses mentioned that, yes, it's good he's here, because Nerses mentioned one thing, that international community prioritizes territorial integrity to self-determination. I totally agree with one reservation, that I think this is mainly about external self-determination, because Armenians, when they have talked about self-determination, they've always meant external, meaning independence or secession. However, I think it is internationally, it's against international law to be against internal self-determination, meaning giving them any status, because even if we look at Western democracies, Northern Ireland has a status in UK, Corsica has a status, or New Caledonia have a status of autonomy in France. you know, Catalonia and Basque Country have autonomous status in Spain. Azerbaijan has been manipulating this notion, abusing territorial integrity, refusing any status to Nagorno-Karabakh, which is completely illegal. And I think that we now need to try to bring up again the notion of autonomy. But as Nerses mentioned, when Armenia does it, it is viewed as a territorial claim, and it should be done by Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians. But the problem here is that Azerbaijan doesn't want to have normal, okay, now we lost Dani, normal negotiations. It is trying just to trap them and dissolve their self-governance institutions, their self-defense force, without any UN peacekeeping force. And I've been dreaming about UN peacekeeping force in Nagorno-Karabakh, but unfortunately now it looks completely unrealistic, because it's not the neoliberalistic times of the beginning of the 20th century. These are very bad times in terms of geopolitical realities. International peacekeeping is dying, even in Africa. Missions are closing. I would even say that Russian Wagner is taking the place of UN peacekeeping in Africa. So now, with UN Security Council doesn't have a consensus, it's impossible to have a UN peacekeeping when Azerbaijan objects to it, and UN Security Council is unable to adopt a resolution. So I will resume here with this agreement that actually there is a need to advocate to the US and European countries, especially US, that they should consider sanctions and harder diplomacy on Azerbaijan, because Aliyev is turning into Milosevic and Saddam Hussein, and soft diplomacy with Aliyev simply doesn't work. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sossi, for your commentary. So heart-wrenching to hear this. I do have some hard questions. I just want to get them out there, and so we can ask them. I also want to invite others to ask questions on the chat. But I just have some existential questions that I'd love all of your 2 cents on, and they're hard to hear. But what is the right thing to do here, in your opinion? Is it to evacuate, give up territory, and save lives, or fight to the bitter end? People subject, for people who are subject to genocide and ethnic cleansing. Is there a way to remain and preserve our territory and our people, with clearly silence being heard across the world right now in terms of help for us?
I'll quickly chime in, and I'm sure Anna will take over this. So we can't go between the two extremes at this point. I think there are several solutions, and the negotiating tracks are designed around that. Sossi correctly mentioned that we don't talk about internal self-determination, because Armenia has always talked about external self-determination. Secession was the objective. But this is why I mentioned the negotiating track between Azerbaijan and Stepanakert, which is designed to potentially, hopefully, both sides could come to some understanding of some form of internal self-determination, or that some special status, which Azeris are right now rejecting, but that is kind of the objective. But what is the resolution, right? If the international community is willing to put sufficient pressure on Azerbaijan, understanding that, yes, Artsakh is not going to have external self-determination, that it's not going to secede, that it's going to be part of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, but at the same time, this population in the 21st century cannot be massacred or starved, or whatever the case might be, right? What are the solutions? And so there have been conversations, for example, about having international instruments, whether it's the form of international peacekeepers, or having international administrators or non-governmental organizations on the ground to provide some security for this population. So in that context, depopulation, or fighting to the bitter end, is the extreme and worst case situation. We're not there yet. At the same time, there are mechanisms, Sossi and Anna spoke about East Timor and Kosovo, where vulnerable populations that are subjected to a blatant ethnic cleansing or organized starvation which are blatant violations of international law, then the situation is no longer about territorial integrity, but about the right to protect. And so conceptually, there are various mechanisms that could be utilized to keep and protect the Armenian population in Artsakh, even within the territorial administration or jurisdiction of Azerbaijan. Now, whether Baku has made the final decision that you're going to do everything they can to depopulate Nagorno-Karabakh, that is a different subject of conversation. But just because Baku has made that determination doesn't mean we're going to go along with it or that the international community is going to be okay with it. So, and Anna's going to talk about this, I'm sure. Diplomacy is all about how you perform in the marathon. There are no sprints, there are no silver bullets. So I would shy away from engaging this sort of, either this extreme or that extreme, and understand the negotiating tracks, the objectives of having solutions that are very different than we had anticipated prior to the war, but still that the population can be preserved and protected and stay in their historical lands.
Mm-hmm. And so just to add, thank you for that. So not the binary, but at the same time, could we speak to the international community for a minute? Is there a country that could put their foot down and say, stop this? Or is there 3 countries that could come together? What are we doing in terms of international? No. Okay, go ahead, Sossi.
Unfortunately, no. I've been advocating for this for almost 3 years since the ceasefire to Western countries, US and EU. And unfortunately, no, not because they don't care. Actually, they do. But it's because they don't know how to deal with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has become a middle-sized power. And as Anna Nerses also mentioned, it's using coercion. It's using blackmail, it's using hybrid war, it's threatening even the US and the European Union. It talks to everybody from the position of power. It has Turkey supporting it. And even without Turkey, it has become quite powerful economically and militarily. And nobody knows how to deal with Azerbaijan. And like maybe in other circumstances, there could be a UN mission or EU mission, even a small mission, let's say even a police mission and not military mission, even a soft EU mission like we have in Armenia would for sure be more efficient than the current Russian peacekeepers who do almost nothing. The only role that they have been playing until now is just to prevent Azerbaijani armed forces to enter Stepanakert. Hopefully, we will not reach that point. But at this point, when they receive food by helicopters and eat it, and local population is starving, and they even buy the rest of the food from the local magazines, I'm not sure. I don't trust them. I have zero trust in the Russian peacekeepers. So yes, it would be better to have even a small, let's say, European Union mission, but it's impossible because in order to have such a mission, there should be either approval of Azerbaijan or UN Security Council resolution, plus it should be EU a consensus amongst 27 member countries, out of which several have strategic partnership agreements with Azerbaijan and receive gas. Only Hungary is sufficient to break the consensus. So it's very, very difficult. Unfortunately, it's a very, very serious situation.
And Sossi, that was so interesting that you said that, because I've always wondered, I mean, not that it would ever happen, but I thought that, frankly, the country with the most capacity is Turkey, because they have the military, understanding, they influenced the Azeris, they could pull Azeris back. But you're saying even without Turkey, Azerbaijan, it's its own entity, can go straight ahead and continue?
I think so. The problem is that Turkey has been totally allying with Azerbaijan. Their permanent representative showed up to the UN Security Council to support Azerbaijan. We don't see a difference of views between Turkey and Azerbaijan. Armenia launched all of that dialogue with Turkey, hoping that we will manage to kind of, how to say, decouple them. and to to ensure that Turkey doesn't always align with Azerbaijan in all of its policies. It would be really useful, but it's not happening under Erdogan.
Can we speak a little bit in terms of, is it possible to assist European, Russian, and USA leaders to reach a joint position to stop the ongoing, well, the blockade, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing? If they can agree, how realistic do you think that is?
The thing is that, and I don't want to monopolize,
yeah,
but Russia has been allying with Azerbaijan because Russia has turned Artsakh into a kind of part of its package deals with Azerbaijan. Right now, Russia is laundering its gas to Europe through Azerbaijan. The gas that Azerbaijan has committed to Europe, it doesn't have that capacity and infrastructure to deliver as much gas as it has committed. So it has increased import of Russian gas at the same time. And according to most of analysts and experts, it's basically laundering Russian gas to Europe. And so Russia has strategic interests with Azerbaijan, and we see increasingly in the last 2 years that Russia is not supporting us even in our territorial integrity issues, and more it is just supporting Azerbaijan in most of the issues. And
Sossi, sorry, can you clarify for us when the Russian mandate, is it 2026 or 2025?
It's 25, but to be honest, I think that either they will leave before, or even if they don't leave before, right now the situation of Armenians in Artsakh is so catastrophic that people may die in several weeks. Literally, I'm saying it with extreme pain, but we need to save lives. And returning to your question about evacuation versus, this is a question that doesn't let me sleep for several weeks, because I've been known for being against the evacuation. I've been opposing other experts when they were offering evacuation, let's say, a year ago or 6 months ago. And now I don't know, because I think that only people in Nagorno-Karabakh, young families with kids, pregnant women, they have right. We cannot decide their fate. They are human beings. From the point of view of Armenian national interest, I think evacuation is totally wrong. But when I look at it from the human perspective, my heart is breaking. I cannot imagine young families, pregnant women, children who are literally starving. And I'm thinking about long-term effects on their health, on their mental health. And I don't know the answer to that question anymore, to be honest. This is the most painful question.
I hear you. It's a hard one. Anna, do you want to weigh in? We haven't heard much from you.
Sure. A couple rather random points and reactions to some of the arguments presented so far. In regards to the as to why I do bring up the East Timor case, I understand your arguments as to how it is different, Sossi, but I think if we're talking about a strategy for national self-determination movement, East Timor case is very important, not just for Nagorno-Karabakh case, but also for many conflict cases, simply because this conflict for several decades was pursued through military means, and it was completely squashed by the government, by the Indonesian government. And yes, the massacre, the Dili massacre, in which 200 people died, played a role, but the independence was not granted immediately. So East Timor actually very deliberately changed the strategy from violent military strategies to deliberately civic disobedience campaigns, peaceful campaigns, organized not only inside East Timor, but also in Indonesia in general, as well as targeting a global environment, global context. So when we're trying to understand strategies moving forward, which I do think is a key question right now as we're thinking about the situation on the ground, Russia's role in such a limbo, and we can talk for hours about this, and the understanding the role of civic disobedience campaign, nonviolence, sustained, needs to be considered. And unfortunately, there is no infrastructure. That the problem I see in Nagorno-Karabakh lacking this infrastructure. Obviously, people are preoccupied by existential issues, but even before the blockade, for a long, long time, I think too much reliance on this or that geopolitical power has degraded this international capacities for advocacy. Now, this is a blockade, severe humanitarian crisis, which the West will not, the United Nations Security Council may or most likely will not call a genocide, because in all cases they tend to hesitate to use that word because then it necessitates an action. But at the same time, I think I understand the severity of the conditions on the ground, but I do see agency for Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and that agency rests with very active, sustained mass protests, at the very least, in order to, and this is a decision for Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, if they're going, that is going to be the decision. Some of the communities will decide to stay. Then, while total independence might not be realistic, status might be less realistic, but still, I do think still on the table, guaranteeing rights, pockets of rights for presence in Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment is possible. Going back, Indonesia, similar, actually, Indonesia was and is an oil-rich state, and Azerbaijan should not be overestimated. Azerbaijan's power should not be overestimated. Some of the stuff that Azerbaijan gets away with, most of the things that Azerbaijan gets away with, is not because Azerbaijan has this superior diplomacy or is this rich state. No, simply because it is a state that is on the side of the territorial integrity. Majority of the states in this world have minorities in this state. So supporting ethnic groups for political status is not something that states like to pursue. Those cases where ethnic groups have succeeded are cases when their violent strategies have been effective as well, but in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, and this is very brutal what I'm saying, the numbers are low. The Armenians cannot afford that strategy. Guerrilla warfare is not a strategy. But at the same time, this is a community that needs to develop, but I think that is where I see the solution, not a solution, but there's not going to be a one big bang magic bullet that is going to solve everything, or one big power who's going to come and make this right. I do think this is a beginning of a process, of a new stage for Nagorno-Karabakh's national self-determination movement, perhaps for a while within Azerbaijan, but that movement, again, looking at comparative quantitative studies, and this is social science is not precise science, that's for sure, but social science is useful in showing trends, in showing patterns. So looking at the social science data, nonviolent civic disobedience campaign, mass protests is a place where Nagorno-Karabakh, as an administrative unit, can exercise some agency in order to secure a place, secure presence in Azerbaijan. So that's a little bit on that. But in regards, and again, I do find it dangerous for us to hope that a particular, I apologize, power is going to take care of this. So building infrastructure for the long term is necessary. And one last point on this, if we're looking at the long-term trends, overall similar conflicts have been resolved by the dominant state accommodating the minorities, either by giving them autonomy, becoming a federal state, democratizing territorial autonomy, more rights. But in all cases, ethnic conflicts in 1970s all the way to 1990s have gone down largely because even authoritarian states have been accommodating. So this is what Aliyev is trying to wiggle his way out. So for Armenia, for Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian diplomacy to be effective, and effectiveness is a very difficult word here, it's important to know as to what to ask for from the international community, asking for protections, for rights within Azerbaijan, asking for a peace process that is sustainable. November Lachin corridor blockage needs to be viewed in the context of the November 9 agreement. So some of the things need to be viewed in this light, but which is why I started my talk with this point, that strategic transformation is needed in the diplomatic posture, both for Nagorno-Karabakh, which right now obviously does not exist, as well as for Armenia. So I'll stop here.
Okay, that's a lot. And we have a lot of questions that I want to pose from the audience as well. I did just want to ask also in terms of realistic goals, and also in terms as an American Armenian myself, what we can do, the diaspora, what can we do to lobby efforts for our government?
If I may start, I saw a question to me about,
Okay.
I think it was about humanitarian airlift. I think it was addressed to me. Both me and Nerses have been writing about this since the beginning of the blockade. The problem is that humanitarian airlift can be done. First, in the beginning, there was no real need for it because ICRC and Russian peacekeepers were bringing in some food. But now, in the last 2 months, there is more than, I mean, it's really a necessity, almost an imperative. The reason why it's not happening is because, again, the international community considers Nagorno-Karabakh as integral part of Azerbaijan and doesn't think that it has a right to carry out a humanitarian airlift without Azerbaijan's permission. Normally, 2 actors can carry out a humanitarian airlift. Okay, 3, but ICRC is already in board, and is already failing, not because it's failing, but because Azerbaijan doesn't allow it to work. But normally it's UNFPA or USAID. It's those 2 actors who have this capacity. But both of them, UN will never do anything without either Azerbaijan's permission or without UN Security Council resolution. Now, to me, now we have this powerful actor called USAID with Samantha Power, who has been the person who has written about the failure of international community to prevent genocides and apologized for not recognizing Armenian genocide in Obama administration. So I think, very frankly speaking, she is the magician, the only person who can actually manage to organize a humanitarian airlift, but she needs to advocate for it very strongly. And Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister, the French minister for humanitarian affairs, has done it in '92 during the First Karabakh War. He has personally delivered humanitarian aid by road, by Lachin corridor when it was blocked again. So now I think that what American Armenian community can do is to advocate to Samantha Power to take this courage and really advocate for it, and in spite of Azerbaijani resistance, just do it.
Thank you, Sossi. I'd like to pose the next question to Anna. It's from the audience. Azerbaijan's maximalism is still paying off after the 44-day war. At what point, however, its maximalism may begin to be detrimental for its policy goals? What would be the red lines that may test the tolerance of the international community? Thank you.
That's a very, very good question. And I think when I say that Azerbaijan is using hybrid warfare strategy, is essentially avoiding using a kinetic direct violence in order to stay within the guardrails, quote unquote, guardrails of the international community. So that is this, which is why it makes it so difficult in pushing back at some of these strategies. Right at the same time, when the war in 2020 started, Ethiopia, the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia also resumed. And while the war in Nagorno-Karabakh ended in 44 days, that conflict has been ongoing, and it has been very brutal. The reason I'm bringing this up, simply to show that there are hundreds of thousands of, if not more, I'm not an expert of that region, were trapped in a blockade. Hunger was used as a weapon. And again, we did not hear much about it. I'm bringing this up to show how low the threshold, how difficult it is to get the attention of the international community. Specific to Azerbaijan, in terms of if the blockade continues, and Azerbaijan has been offering alternatives, which has been making it difficult to clarify the point that essentially the way I see the situation on the ground is live free or die. That's the position that Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh are taking, right? If they're not taking alternatives. So if that's the position, then how come we're not seeing that in the diplomatic language, either from Armenia or from any advocacy and the limited voice that Nagorno-Karabakh has? That is a powerful message to say, because that's the situation on the ground. So in terms of as to where are the guardrails, again, I do not want to overestimate, I would not want to overestimate Azerbaijan's position. It is getting away with the things that it does, simply because other similar conflict cases, states behave that way. The international climate right now is difficult because the third parties who do intervene, the number of cases where third actors would intervene on the side of a minority or an ethnic group has gone down. This is sort of a legacy result of the 9/11, where ethnic conflicts and terrorism were linked together. So in most cases, third players intervene on the side of states, reinforcing state sovereignty notion, which is an important notion for the Armenian state, by the way. For small states, territorial integrity is a very important, powerful norm. But back to this question, very good question. I do think that if Azerbaijan continues with this blockade, Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh need to be much, much more vocal. There have to be protests. This is a very kind of simple point that I'm making, but I would not be making that point if I have not looked at the data of similar cases. So Azerbaijan is going to get away with this as long as Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh maintain the status quo, hoping that Russia will come to its senses or the United Nations Security Council would do something. In contrast to even in case of African conflicts, there is no regional institutions, regional peacekeeping, regional tribunals, regional human rights courts. These do not exist for the region, which makes it very difficult to prosecute this. So Aliyev will continue with this hybrid strategies, non-kinetic, and it can do it because if it does use violence, it will be politically costly. But number one, I do think Nagorno-Karabakh needs to be politically a lot more noisy, a lot more strategic, a lot more savvy. And I realize I'm not on the ground. It's hard for me to say what I'm saying, how much of it is possible. So my view is very much detached in that respect. But at the same time, in terms of what we're asking from the West, being realistic and understanding that any pushback any change is going to be incremental, that the change on the ground is going to come from Baku is really crucial for us to keep in mind. International community is important, but when we talk about Stepanakert-Baku dialogue, Baku needs to be pushed for that dialogue. And to do that, the incentive structure for Baku needs to change. What are the weaknesses? We tend to talk about the strength of Azerbaijani state. Now, understanding the weaknesses of Azerbaijani state is also important. I mentioned in my comments the fact that any protest activity needs to be linked with what's going on inside Azerbaijan. The environmental, the Soyudo, the village was crushed. Linking within rhetoric, the posters, that needs to happen. The fact that the borders are closed and there is, because it's authoritarian state, we do not see the internal cleavages. We do not see the potential allies, tactical allies. All we hear, and it is true, anti-Armenian diet that they have been feeding this nation, and that is true. Some of it is historical, but at the same time, there are groups that are choking inside this state. Number two, oil resources the hydrocarbon resources are very, very low. Even with the pumping up of Russian oil, Azerbaijan is providing only a few countries. It's it's not make or break of European posture in this conflict. The Western posture has to do with diplomatic laziness, not wanting to do the work in protection, in providing the security. That's something for the Armenian community outside to ask for. Traditional diplomatic lobbying institutions, as well as the embassies, who need to work together to know what is realistic to expect from the West. What is needed is also, coordination, understanding what's happening inside, and the weakening of behind every strong man, there is a weak state. I always say this. This is the case for Russia. This is the case for Azerbaijan. This is an institutionally weak state that is heading to global green transition within reform apparatus. And we are having this conversation at a time when there's AI technology, the impact of which on statehood as an institution of state, on governance, is misunderstood, is not understood, not misunderstood. I am a political scientist by training. I have to sit down and research this. There are a lot of unknowns here. But understanding, yes, the international climate is a difficult one. The number of ethnic conflicts has increased, but the number of negotiated settlements did not increase. But also, the parallel trend is that war as an instrument of getting political goals is also not effective. Just ask Russia or ask Ukraine as well on this. So the evolution of non-victory is the development that is also happening. People are organized, people are more connected. So the picture is not black and white, but understanding the weaknesses inside Azerbaijan is crucial. And essentially, Azerbaijan will get away with so much if Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh stay quiet. The cost and incentives on Baku regime need to change.
Anna, thank you for that. And I'd love for you to answer this in light of, there was a comment posted by Dr. Ohanyan, and in light of what you said about behind every strong man, there is a weak state. Can you respond to this comment? We Armenians do not understand the reality. The superpowers created the situation and only they can fix it, solve it. The rest is imagination. We are very small we are a very small dot in the international game. There's only international interests. History starting 1 to 2023 is witness to this. And look at the Armenian 2023 years of history, at least. So Dr. Ohanyan posted that. Can you comment to it? Or Nerses, would you like to? Either one.
I mean, listen, as political scientists, we engage in the empirical data and sort of the factual assessments of developments. Of course, international powers play a role, but engaging in sort of what may, for some, already conspiratorial, as if this was constructed by unseen powers or whatever the case might be, we have to kind of thread very carefully there. But clearly, the interests of international powers are playing a very important determining role in the region as we speak. The negotiating platform, for example, has been a platform of competition between powers. U.S. objective, for example, in pushing hard for a solution of the conflict isn't so much about Armenia, for example, or Artsakh, but it's about diminishing Russian influence in the region. So clearly there are international components involved. But to suggest that Armenia has no agency or that Azerbaijan is basically someone's tool or anything like that, that oversimplifies an extraordinarily complex regional dynamic. So in that context, I would so much shy away from those kind of very broad, abstract statements. But fundamentally, in principle, yes, the international powers do play a role. Now, I want to kind of touch up on something that Anna spoke in detail, and kind of this ties into it as well. We have to understand that Azerbaijan is doing what Armenia kind of did after 1994. Okay, they're engaging what we call strategic narcissism. There's a lot of hubris, and their objective is to humiliate Armenia. And so when we're surprised and we turn to the international community, even to these big actors, and we tell them, listen, they're doing all this humiliation. Why aren't we acting up on it? We have to understand that for 30 years, the international community and these large powers that we're looking at considered Azerbaijan to be the victim. We were viewed as the aggressor, whether we like it or not. And so that has been an important component in shaping the narrative and why they have been to a large extent indifferent to the suffering of Armenians post 2020. And so when we see the regional configurations developing, right, of course, it's the interests of the superpowers that matter. It's just the interests of the regional powers that matter. The United States is only going to use amount of political capital necessary to advance its interests. They're not going to expand political capital for the well-being of the Armenians. Russians, obviously, as Sossi mentioned, have written extensively, right? When I started talking about 6 months ago of a Russo-Azerbaijani axis, there was no conversation of that. Many thought that Russia is still Armenia's ally. It's not. Right now, Russia's interests, by virtue of developments in Ukraine, are heavily aligned with Azerbaijan. So alignment and decoupling of interests is a natural part of geopolitics, of regional politics. We need to be cognizant of that. But that isn't the same as suggesting Armenia has no say, we're irrelevant, and that the big boys are going to decide. They may develop the conditions as to how things may develop, but Armenia still has a lot of agency and does need to exercise that.
May I also react to this? Because
Yes.
I also saw that Dr. Asyan Aslanyan repeated the same point. I have to strongly object to this. I agree with Nerses that we shouldn't underestimate the agency of Armenia as a small state. And I should even say that the reason we have appeared where we are now is that we have actually underestimated our agency. And between the first and second wars in Artsakh, we have been extremely lazy. We have failed our nation building, if I can put it in the most brutal terms. We have failed our defense institution building. We haven't modernized our army. And we have at the same time failed the diplomacy, just getting used to this strange status quo of being accused of occupying not just Nagorno-Karabakh, but surrounding territories, and thinking that we can just prolong this situation endlessly. And we have allowed us to become totally dependent on Russia in terms of security, economy, and energy. So we have basically eliminated, or not eliminated, but reduced our agency as a small state instead of trying to increase it as some other small states do, like Israel or Finland or Singapore or Sweden. And that's why we are where we are. But I just hope that the game is not over. And now I'm quoting Azerbaijani Aliyev's assistant, which repeats the same time all the time that the game is over for Armenians. No, we should be resilient. We should collect and compose ourselves and mobilize all of our internal resources and try to make very serious amendments in our foreign policy. We already know Russia is not our ally, and we actually don't want it to be our ally because it's largely stigmatized on the international scene, and it's not even good to have such an ally. So we have to build new partnerships and alliances, which is incredibly difficult, but at least we have countries like France and India that are ready to help at the moment, at least to our sovereignty. And we need to mobilize, build our IT, high technologies, as artificial intelligence, as you mentioned. And no, we shouldn't refuse from our agency, because if we accept this fatalistic determination approach, we should just refuse from being an independent state and surrender. So I'm sorry, I don't agree with this approach.
Okay, thank you, Sossi. I also want to take a moment now to acknowledge that we have Maria Tatikyan, the owner of EVN Report, the very powerful EVN. And I'd like her to be recognized amongst the audience members and ask her for any brief comment or questions or voice or opinion that she may have about any of this. Maria? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Hi, thank you.
No, we're honored to have you here today.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor for me to be here, and an honor to be with three very good friends, Sossi, Anna, and Nerses, who have graced the pages of EVN Report and with their insights and their knowledge and their passion for everything to do with Armenia and Artsakh. Sorry, I was dealing with another situation at the moment. I just want to say that sometimes we need to take a step back and look at the issue from sort of 30,000 feet. Sometimes we get caught up in our own echo chambers and we don't take into consideration all the factors that are impacting what is taking place. And I really appreciate ARPA Institute for giving a voice to these incredible scholars and to everybody who's taking part. So I don't want to, I'm sure a lot of people have questions that they want to ask. I have the ears and the intellect of the people on the panel, so I will let the other people ask the questions. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for joining today. We also have a question by Viken Vorperyan. Viken asks, has there been an effort to expose the ethno-nationalistic predatory behavior and terror practices of Azerbaijan towards Armenians, that the original Armenian occupation was to address bombing of Stepanakert and Sumqayit and Baku in 1988 to 1990?
I can answer to this, if I may. When I was talking about our diplomatic laziness and defeats, this included that during the 30 years, there was a strange prejudice in the Armenian Foreign Ministry, where I have personally worked for more than a decade, not to apply international legal mechanisms and not to expose those massacres and the attempt of genocide and ethnic cleansing by Azerbaijan in 1990s. I think it was also related with the fact that we were kind of illegally holding the surrounding territories to Nagorno-Karabakh. It would be difficult to justify it and apply international legal mechanisms at the same time. So now, basically, we made our first legal claim to International Court of Justice in September 2021, and this is an ongoing process, but it's in line with the Convention of Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which includes ethnic hatred, and this is where we also raised the blockade of Lachin corridor issue. But the problem is that those processes are very long. They take several years. And the fear is that people in Artsakh will not be able to wait so much in this critical situation. And even if the court decides that Azerbaijan has been really conducting the policy of ethnic cleansing and massacres, it may be too late. And also, it's not really how it's called? I forgot the word. Retroactive, yeah?
Retroactive, yes.
Yes, because it may not cover the past, so it's kind of difficult. And the other issue is that we should absolutely join International Criminal Court, ratify Rome Statute. We have declared our intention months ago. There was a constitutional issue there inconsistency issue, which is now resolved. But then this, when we're ready to ratify it, this issue of Putin detention, imprisonment came up. So it became really difficult for us, being legally an ally to Russia. But as far as I know, Armenia does intend to ratify Rome Statute in the forthcoming months. My position is that we had to do it much in advance.
Thank you, Sossi. Thank you for your concluding remarks. Anna and Nerses, I'd love for you to give a couple minutes of concluding remarks as we wrap up.
I'll take my 2 minutes to sort of go back to the point on great powers determining the fate of Armenians or any small nations. And I'm going to, in the chat, I don't know if you see it, I'm going to put a link to my last book where actually, I don't know if you guys.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Actually, I do try to get to that question. In my research, what I have been arguing is that great powers are important security providers, but obviously they're also creating risks. Depending on structure of great power alliances, countries can be pulled into warfare. So it's not so straightforward that finding one geopolitical patron will solve all of the issues, especially now when the world is a lot more fragmented. In that respect, I have tried to show in my research that great powers can do a lot of damage to regions, and that the sources of peace and stability are very much regional. And understanding the dynamics of regional politics in managing great power rivalry is critical. And one more point on Russia. And I'm sanctioned by Russia, so I probably would be the last person making this. But I disagree, Sossi, that Armenia needs to do a detour from Russia. Russia is a very difficult ally, if we can even call it that. Russia is a liability for Armenia, the Security Council. But at the same time, I do think the Armenian foreign policy does need to factor in Russia's presence in the region. And many voices in Armenia are advocating for a detour. I simply would end by saying that thinking about security in regional terms, leveraging Georgia much more directly, being careful in managing Russian relations with Russia is also crucial. But I don't think Armenia can simply advocate for a detour from Russia. It's going to be costly. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
I didn't advocate for detour. I advocated for developing partnerships, other partnerships, just to clarify. I'm not radical. I'm not radical.
Thank you, Sossi. Thank you, Anna. And finally, Nerses, concluding remarks.
Thank you, Ani.
Sure.
I think we're all on the same page here. One thing that I do want to discuss in the context of the previous question, for 30 years, we've always viewed ourselves as being righteous in the cause of Artsakh, and we have from our own lens. That's not how the international community sees it. So we have to be very honest about that. So we do have a long list, right, a long litany of all the ethno-national and terrible things that Azerbaijan has done. We could go into the historical roots and qualify and justify to ourselves. The international community is not buying it. And so we have to understand that when we speak in this language, we're speaking to the international community. We have to stop talking to ourselves. And so when we present our grievances, Azerbaijan presents equal grievances. And the international community looks at both and says, well, you occupied their territory from our lands, therefore you're the aggressor and they're the victim. Our inability to understand this dynamic, regardless of how much we disagree with it, has been instrumental in leading us to make false or incorrect policies. And so when we start yelling into the wind saying, why aren't they listening? Why aren't they understanding what we're saying? What they're saying is, you're not understanding our position. And this has produced extensive complications for us. And so for 25 years, Azerbaijan has shaped a narrative that allowed them to do what they did in 2020, and it gave them the political capital to continue from that, where Armenia is just building. And Sossi was right. Whether we've been lazy, we relied on Russia, whether the diaspora has underperformed by falling into that false narrative, there could be a bunch of things we could get into. But the important thing that I want to mention is that if we want to address our problems, we need to understand the position of both the opposite side and those who are asking to solve our problems. And so if the United States and the West is saying you're an occupying force, and we tell them, no, we're not, that's it. There's a disconnect. I'm being very simple. I'm producing this in a very simplified anecdotal way. So we can go back and talk about the historic roots and all the ethno-national complexities that come with it. And Azerbaijan does the same with their own revisionist, faux, nonsensical historical interpretations that are absurd. But the international community doesn't want to hear that. They don't care. It's not changing the game. So I think we have to change the way we talk to the world. And this is why I keep saying we need to shy away from the way we talk to each other and the way we talk to the rest of the world. And that's going to be crucial going forward on this point.
Brilliant note to end it on. Thank you so much. Thank you. We've run out of time, and so we are going to have to leave the conversation there. I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, Dr. Anna Ohanyan, and Sossi Tatikyan for taking these hard questions, and for all of you for watching and caring. Thank you from me, Ani Shabazian, and the whole team here at the ARPA Institute. Dr. Panosyan?
Thank you very much, Ani. And thank you, Anna and Nerses and Sossi, for this wonderful and exciting discussion. We have a lot of problems. We have to change a lot of things, but the road ahead is very difficult, and so I think we still have a lot of struggles to go through. Thank you very much, and we're going to have another panel discussion on the 12th of September. You will receive the flyer soon, and it will be related to a project that is very important for women, which is going on right now in the American University of Armenia, which we think is a very important program to present. So we'll see you hopefully on the 12th. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.